It's summer 1943. The largest tank battle in history is about to begin at Kursk. German commanders are confident. They've rolled out their newest, most powerful tanks, the Tiger and the Panther. On paper, these were unstoppable monsters. Thick armor, devastating cannons, the kind of machines that made Allied crews tremble at the mere rumor of their presence. But here's the twist. Before many of them could even fire a single shot, they were already useless. Engines seized, gearboxes shattered, tanks stuck axle-deep in mud. In fact, during several operations, up to 80% of German tanks were out of action before the first clash. Not because of Soviet firepower, but because the machines themselves broke down. This is the story of how 80% of panzers never made it to the fight. Germany's armored doctrine was built on speed and shock. The early blitzkrieg victories in Poland and France relied on reliable Panzer IIIs and IVs, not perfect machines. But by 1942, facing the Soviet T-34, Hitler demanded new, more powerful models at breakneck speed. Factories worked around the clock, and designs that should have taken years of testing were shoved straight into battle. The Panther, for example, was revolutionary on paper. Sloped armor like the T-34, a deadly 75mm gun, and mobility that rivaled lighter tanks. But in its early versions, it was a disaster. At Kursk, nearly half the Panthers broke down before firing a shot. Engines caught fire, transmissions failed, and final drives, the crucial gears that transferred engine power to the tracks, snapped under stress. Tigers too carried fearsome reputations, but they were plagued by overheated engines, fragile suspensions, and a transmission that could barely handle the tank's enormous weight. Instead of rolling into battle as proven war machines, many of these tanks were essentially prototypes, still in the testing stage, yet thrown into the most brutal battlefield in history. The price of perfectionism under pressure? Fragile machines that failed their crews when it mattered most. But here is the thing, tanks don't fight alone. Behind every tank you see in a photograph, there are dozens of trucks, fuel convoys, mechanics and workshops keeping it alive. In the early years of the war, when Germany fought in compact theaters like Poland or France, this lifeline kept up. But on the vast steppes of Russia or in the endless deserts of North Africa, that fragile supply system collapsed. Fuel trucks lagged hundreds of miles behind the front. Spare parts warehouses were bombed or simply never existed in the quantities needed. And German industry, already stretched thin, couldn't produce replacements fast enough. A Panther could be sidelined for weeks, waiting on something as small as a gasket or a gear. Desperate crews became scavengers. They stripped parts from knocked-out vehicles, cannibalizing wrecks to keep a handful of tanks operational. The irony was brutal. For every Panther that managed to keep moving, 2 or 3 others were abandoned on the roadside, left behind not by enemy fire, but by mechanical attrition. German tank units often looked intimidating on paper, hundreds of machines strong, but in reality, only a fraction were actually ready to fight. Even when supplies did arrive, the terrain itself became an enemy. In Russia, the infamous Rasputitsa, or mud season, swallowed panzers whole. These weren't just dirt roads turning muddy, they became oceans of muck thick enough to drown a tank, road wheels clogged with mud and ice, tracks jammed until they snapped, and engines overheated under the strain of trying to move a 40-ton machine through quicksand-like terrain. And when winter hit, things got even worse. Oil turned to sludge in the cold, batteries froze solid, and steel parts became brittle enough to crack. Crews lit fires under their tanks just to warm the engines enough to start. In North Africa, the opposite problem arose. Fine desert sand infiltrated gearboxes, scoured pistons, and clogged radiators. Dust storms blinded drivers and stripped engines from the inside out. German tanks, designed for Europe's roads and fields, were never meant for these extremes. In many cases, nature destroyed more panzers than enemy shells ever could. Machines break, but it's men who fix them. In the early years, Germany's armored corps was staffed with experienced crews and mechanics. Veterans who could spot a problem by sound or smell. They nursed their tanks along, catching faults before they became failures. But as the war dragged on and losses mounted, replacements were rushed to the front. Green recruits suddenly found themselves in charge of temperamental beasts. Veterans knew that a Panther needed hours of careful maintenance each night just to survive another day. Rookies skipped checks, whether from exhaustion or ignorance. Orders from above pushed units to keep advancing, leaving no time for proper upkeep. Mechanics worked by lantern light in freezing mud, patching tanks with whatever they had on hand. The pressure to keep moving meant corners were cut and breakdowns multiplied. Imagine being a 19-year-old recruit, handed the keys to a Tiger tank that required the delicate care of a race car, then told to march 200 miles across hostile terrain with no fuel trucks in sight. The result was predictable: mechanical collapse. German tanks were technological marvels, but often too clever for their own good. Take the interleaved road wheels of the Panther and Tiger. On smooth ground, they reduced vibration and gave a steady ride. But in Russia's mud and snow, they trapped debris, froze solid, and made simple repairs a nightmare. Replacing one wheel in the field often required removing several others first, wasting precious hours. The Tiger's immense weight was another flaw. Bridges collapsed under it, suspensions snapped, and towing a disabled Tiger often required multiple other tanks, if they were even available. The Panther's final drives were so fragile that German crews joked the tank had a self-destruct system built in. Compare that to the Soviet T-34. Rugged, simple, and designed to be fixed in the field with basic tools, it could keep running in conditions that sidelined German machines. German tanks were like high-performance sports cars in a demolition derby. Impressive to look at, terrifying in theory, but completely unsuited for the brutal reality of prolonged warfare. As the war dragged on, Allied bombing campaigns began targeting German industry itself. Factories producing tanks and spare parts were shattered or forced to scatter underground. To survive, German production decentralized, but that came with chaos. Parts weren't standardized, and frontline units often received mismatched components. Imagine waiting weeks for a replacement part, only to discover it doesn't fit your tank. The logistical chaos was so severe that some German commanders wrote reports describing tanks left idle for months, simply because a single component never arrived. The Allies didn't need to destroy every Panzer in the field. By choking off the flow of spare parts and fuel, they ensured many would never even reach the battlefield in the first place. Finally, Germany's doctrine itself worked against its tanks. The Blitzkrieg philosophy emphasized constant forward momentum. Never stop, never give the enemy time to regroup. That doctrine worked in short, sharp campaigns in Poland, France, and the Low Countries. But in Russia, with endless distances and brutal weather, it burned through men and machines alike. There was no time to rest tanks, to cycle them back for maintenance, or to rotate crews. Units pushed forward until their machines simply collapsed under the strain. The very doctrine that brought Germany its early victories now condemned its armoured corps to mechanical exhaustion. At Kursk, some panzer crews worked all night just to keep their machines moving. Mechanics hammered bearings into place by lantern light, scavenging parts from burned out wrecks. A few tanks managed to limp into battle thanks to these desperate repairs, but for every miracle, dozens of panzers sat abandoned, lining the roads like silent monuments to overreach.